Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Roll Up Varsity. It's your boy Connor, going solo again this week. Looking forward to an exciting episode here. We're going to have a writer from a state of Florida school on to join us here in just a moment. But before we get into that, obviously want to shout out our title sponsor as always, Intense Fitness. Intense Fitness is an elite one-on-one personal training facility located at 1536 East Commercial Boulevard in Oakland Park, Florida. Established in 2012, they've developed a reputation for training all walks of life from high-level athletes to the senior communities. Mention you heard about Intense Fitness from the Roll Up Varsity podcast and receive a complimentary workout and evaluation. Once again, that is Intense Fitness at 1536 East Commercial Boulevard in Oakland Park, Florida. Mention that you heard about them from myself, Curtis, anybody associated with the Varsity podcast, and you will get a complimentary workout and evaluation. But without any further ado, not a crazy big show today, just a couple of top schools we want to go over. And then we'll get into some of the bigger commitments from across the country, as well as welcome our guest on in a bit. So before we get into all of that, we definitely want to make sure that we shout out the top schools for four-star offensive tackle Spencer. I think it's pronounced Fano from Provo, Utah. He's narrowed his list of schools down to 4: Michigan, BYU, Utah, and Oregon. And that's going to be the only 2023 prospect that we have here tonight. The other two that we're going to talk about here is going to be some 2024 prospects. And that first one we're going to lead off with is 4-star number 7 edge and top 50 player in the country, Adarius Hayes. Hayes is a prospect from Largo High School, and he has narrowed his list of schools down to 8. Those schools being Florida, Georgia, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Alabama, Texas A&M, UCF, and Notre Dame. Hayes is one of the top prospects in the country for the 2024 class, so we want to make sure we shout out that top schools as well. And then the last that we're going to cover is 2024 4-star wide receiver Mazio Bennett from Greenville, South Carolina. He has also narrowed his list of schools down to 8, with South Carolina, Oregon, FSU, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Miami, and Alabama making that cut. He has a commitment date set for October 16th, so we are not far away from that commitment from one of the top prospects in the 2024 class. We're going to move over to a few commitments that we've had happen over the last couple weeks since we've been on the podcast. Once again, we were offline last week due to Hurricane Ian hitting Florida. Myself, I lost power in Orlando, wasn't able to jump on. Thoughts and prayers go out to everybody affected by Hurricane Ian. Luckily enough, my family and I were not hit too bad, so very, very blessed in that aspect. But for those of you that were not so lucky, our thoughts and prayers go out to you, and we're back on this week like we never left. So for the commitments, we're going to jump into the Lakeland trio that we mentioned last week, with Dadrian Zipper committing to Pittsburgh, Kamari McKinley committing to Toledo, and Twan Wilson committing to Jackson State. And then our next round of commitments are going to be some FSU guys. But before we get into those, I want to make sure that we welcome on our guest here, because he's going to be able to help us break down a little bit of those commitments for FSU. We have Zach Blostein, the publisher for Noles 247. Zach, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
What's up? How's it going?
It's going great, man. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Hope everyone's safe from the storm. Doing well up here in Tallahassee. Luckily, we didn't get hit. But yeah, excited to talk with you guys.
Yeah, man. Really excited to have you on. We've talked a lot about Florida State on this podcast. We've talked specifically about Coach Atkins because he's done an unbelievable job since the second he stepped on to Tallahassee, or Florida State's campus in Tallahassee. My apologies. But a couple of big commitments within this last week and a half, 2 weeks. Highlighted by 5-star number 3 wide receiver in the composite, Hakeem Williams. Give us a little bit about Hakeem, man, because that's a huge commitment for Florida State. Somebody that I think for quite a while was kind of leaning towards A&M, or at least the public perception was that way, but ended up deciding to commit to the Noles.
Yeah, so Florida State's been in this recruitment for a while, but they were kind of quiet early on, like you mentioned. Other schools like Texas A&M were considered the leader early, along with like Georgia, Miami, and a few others. Um, but it was a late July visit. They opened that 1 week, I'm sure you know, in late July for recruits to get on campuses at the schools they're interested in. And Hakeem chose to come to Florida State. He was there for 4 days, and I was told that basically right after that, he knew that he was going to FSU. He waited about a month to tell the staff. He told us that in person when we went over there to his ceremony down in South Florida. Uh, I think it was 2 weeks ago now or 3 weeks ago. But he said that he informed the staff like a month after. It was kind of around when Florida State played that LSU game. He was there in New Orleans for that. So that was a huge difference maker for them, getting him there in person for that huge win. And that's kind of where the tide turned, and that's how FSU landed his commitment. Obviously, they've got a long way to go, right? Like as you guys know, no one's recruitment's done until signing day, so they definitely have to battle with schools like Texas A&M and Georgia and others. But a huge win for Mike Norvell and his staff.
Yeah, like you said, a long way to go in that recruitment, and he pretty much made that well known at his ceremony where he said, "Listen, the recruiting process isn't over me." I'm kind of paraphrasing.
Yeah.
So what do you think it's going to take for maybe somebody to flip him from Florida State, and then how hard is it going to be for FSU to try and keep him committed? Because as you know, everybody in the country is going to be after that kid.
Yeah, I mean he's a dude. So I'd expect none of the schools that were in on his recruitment. I don't expect any of them to stop recruiting him. I think that'd be a disservice on all those staffs' behalf. So yeah, for Florida State's sake, they got to keep winning games. They had a really great start to the season. They went 4-0. Obviously, picked up their first loss against Wake Forest this past weekend. But they got to have continued success. They can't just go lay an egg the rest of the season. I don't think that means 10, 11 wins, but they got to pick up some quality wins. I think winning against Miami or maybe even Florida later in the season, like those would be big wins, especially for a guy like Hakeem who resides in the state of Florida. But yeah, I think it's going to be tough. There's going to be a lot of teams after Hakeem. I've heard Alabama's picked up some contact with him. So FSU has their hands full, but I think it's better for them to have him committed than for them to go try and flip him away from some of the other powers that were involved in his recruitment early on.
Yeah, it's always better to have the kid committed and make them have to decommit than have them not be on the commit list at all. And FSU last week started a pretty, I don't want to say brutal stretch, but definitely one of the probably the toughest stretch of their schedule with obviously Wake Forest and NC State and Clemson coming up in back-to-back weeks over the next couple weeks. So definitely be monitoring that to see how well they do against programs that have really put themselves out in front on the college football landscape. And if they're able to win a couple of those games, I'm sure Hakeem will definitely see the positivity and the progress that Coach Mike Norvell is making over there in Tallahassee. The other commitment we wanted to talk about of that happened over the last week or so was Blake Nicholson. They were able to pluck a 4-star linebacker out of the state of California. What was it about Florida State that really made him want to make that trek all the way across the country from California to Tallahassee?
Yeah, well, there's a few factors that came into this. Oregon was kind of the school that everyone perceived to be the leader, but Florida State really never gave up in the recruitment. He took officials to both schools over the summer, and then kind of same kind of timeline as Hakeem. He took that end of July visit to FSU, and that's where the tide kind of turned in the recruitment. But yeah, there's a few factors why Nicholson was comfortable making the move over to Florida State. Obviously, a huge distance from his hometown over there in Manteca, California. But yeah, so his parents are considering moving down, somewhere in the Southeast. They want to relocate. So that's a part of why he's so comfortable coming down here. And then also the relationships he's formed with multiple staff members at FSU, like General Manager Derek Ray, who's from that area, the same area, Manteca, California. And then Randy Shannon, who I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. He's the linebackers coach at Florida State now, and he did a great job recruiting Nicholson throughout the process. And they have a really good bond, and that's a big reason why he committed to the Seminoles.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard for any college football fan to hear the name Randy Shannon and not know who's being talked about.
Exactly, especially in
He's
the state of
coached at
Florida.
almost every
Yeah.
school in the state of Florida
Yeah.
over the course of his coaching tenure. So pretty hard not to know who that is. But somebody we already mentioned, Coach Atkins. He's done a phenomenal job, really in a time where Florida State's recruiting maybe not have been up to FSU standards. He was still recruiting at that level, just pulling blue chip after blue chip in the trenches. What is it about Coach Atkins that makes him such a good recruiter? I know he got the promotion from just offensive line coach to offensive coordinator over the last year. Was that kind of a move by Mike Norvell to try and keep him in Tallahassee longer, or what can you tell us about Coach Atkins?
Yeah, to note on his upgrade, I think that definitely was. I mean, Atkins has done a great job with the O line in Tallahassee. Everyone knows that FSU struggled on the O line. He's done a great job in fixing some of their problems there. But also, other schools have come calling for Atkins during his time at FSU. But he's known that Norvell promotes from within. So he kind of trusted the process, and this year obviously gets the OC title next to his name. So that was huge. But what makes him such a great recruiter? He's so personable. Every recruit mentions it. Like he's not a guy that's calling you every day, every other day. Even it's a couple times a week, and he's just kind of he just builds a relationship so well with these recruits, and it's just so natural. And if you talk to any of the commits, any of the guys that Atkins is after, I mean, most of them say that he's one of the closest guys they're with on any staff in the country. So he does an excellent job, and he's built up this 2023 class, like you mentioned. They have two really great commitments in Lucas Simmons and Roderick Kearney. They're after a few others, and like you mentioned, he was the strong suit on this staff, even when recruiting was struggling and the on-field results weren't there. Like he was still producing at his position, which is huge for Florida State because that's it was a huge position of need. And they've kind of alleviated that a little bit. Obviously, this season they've been plagued with injuries a bit, so it doesn't look perfect. But they've definitely got more depth now, and they're building up, youth wise within that position room.
Yeah, you can definitely see when you watch Florida State that the offensive line has progressed over the last few years. And you mentioned Roderick Kearney. So as somebody that covers Florida, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about him because I think for it was a 2 or 3 week stretch. He was at Florida each week. And you even put a flip prediction in on 247 for him to flip to Florida. Do you still feel good about that prediction? Has anything changed since he hasn't really been on Florida's campus over the last few weeks? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so at the time of putting in that pick, obviously, as everyone knows, like crystal balls are, they can change. And I think if I was still predicting today, I think I'd still predict him to flip, just because I think at that time, like I was really confident that something was going to happen. I thought he was at least going to decommit, not even just flip. I think he was just going to open things up. But as I mentioned, like Atkins does a great job with his guys. I think they've alleviated some things. He was on FSU's campus for their game against Boston College, where FSU went out and handled business for the first time in a while against an ACC foe. But yeah, I still think there's work to be done. I don't think it's Florida State it's over. They've got him locked in. I would expect him to visit probably UF again this season, and maybe some other schools like Georgia. I know was mentioned with him as another school trying to get involved. But yeah, I think I'm not as confident that he's going to flip anymore. But I definitely don't think it's a fully locked in pledge for Kearney to FSU.
So staying kind of towards the offensive line, one of the crown jewels of FSU's class is offensive tackle Lucas Simmons. Is it Simmons or Simons?
Simmons.
Simmons. Okay. So yeah, Lucas Simmons. I got the opportunity to see him at Future 50 a few months back, and physically he's super impressive. At standing at every bit of 6'7", 6'8", and he's very lean at 300 pounds. What do you think is that somebody? Because I think what is one or two of FSU's offensive tackles or upperclassmen are going to be gone in the next year or two. Do you think he's somebody that can come in and play early? What do you like about his game?
Yeah, I think like he's got a little ways to go just technique wise, but man, like his frame is so perfect for a prototypical left tackle. That's what everyone's craving these days. Like they're it's rare. You're not going to find 6'7", 6'8" guys that are built like that all the time. But when you do, they're always super prioritized. And Atkins when handled business against a few other schools that were heavily in the mix, like UF, Tennessee, and USC. So that was a huge recruitment for them to win. As far as his game and his impact at FSU, I think it's still going to take probably a year or maybe two for him to crack the rotation, because I think he's got to kind of you know build out into his frame. You mentioned he's kind of lean at 300 pounds. I think he can put on a little bit more weight. And then technique wise, like once he gets in Atkins' position room and kind of gets that one-on-one coaching, I think that's going to be super beneficial for him. So I don't expect him to be a year one contributor, but year two, year three, definitely.
Awesome. And then Florida State's recruiting class right now sits at number 16, which is the highest they've had, at least currently in Mike Norvell's tenure. Um, what kind of prospects are still out there that are maybe uncommitted or kids that FSU is looking to flip that would get them maybe into that top 15 and even push in the top 10 range if they have a really good season?
Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely contingent on them continuing to win. But a few other names that they're still after. They don't have an expansive board of guys they're after. It's just a few other guys they're trying to add to this class, and then they're going to do what they do best and go in the transfer portal after the season. But out of the high school ranks, I would definitely say Miami Central defensive lineman Ruben Bain is a high priority for them. He just set up another visit to FSU for the Clemson game, so he's a guy they're really hard, going after hard. And then another defensive lineman Jordan Hall at a West Side in Jacksonville. I don't think FSU's a front runner there or even close to the top, but they got some work to do. They definitely have to get him back on campus, but he's someone they value a lot, and they love to get back on campus. He was supposed to come a few weekends ago, but that visit fell through. But he's definitely really high on their board. And then at the offensive line position, DJ Chester, top 247 offensive lineman from over there at Eagles Landing in Georgia. He is extremely talented. I think FSU sits in a pretty good spot for him. LSU's another school involved, and I think he was at Ole Miss for an official visit over this past weekend. And then Auburn, I think, is another program that hosted him recently. And then the last guy out of the high school ranks, I'll give you Damari Brown, the American Heritage defensive back. He's a dude that FSU really wants. He'd be the crown jewel of that DB class. Obviously, FSU's been known to recruit pretty well at the defensive back position, but this class has been kind of, I wouldn't say lackluster, but just not to the standard of what we usually see. But Damari Brown would definitely bring it back to that, because I think he's a real deal guy out of South Florida, out of a powerhouse school like American Heritage, which it's pretty rare for guys out of Heritage to not hit. So FSU definitely wants him, and he's going to be on an official visit in 2 weekends for that Clemson game as well.
So you mentioned the defensive backs class and Damari Brown. Watching the Wake Forest game this last weekend, I kind of noticed that a lot of FSU's defensive backs were pretty undersized as compared to the bigger receivers at Wake Forest. And I'm scrolling through FSU's recruiting class, I've noticed that the couple guys that they have committed at defensive back are 6'1" plus. Is that kind of a concerted effort that they're working on trying to get some bigger defensive backs to try and combat these uber athletic 6'3", 6'4" receivers that seem to be just abound in college football nowadays?
Yeah, they definitely value height as far as when it comes to recruiting defensive backs. That's been consistent throughout Norvell's entire tenure, and they've been pretty selective in this class of getting guys, but they like the upside of guys like Jarreau Rawls and Quindarius Jones and Kenton Kirkland. That all those guys like you mentioned, they're all over 6'1". So definitely has the class definitely has a lot of size. Not guys that are super heralded recruits, but they're guys that FSU thinks they hit on, eval wise, that maybe are being a little bit, under recruited. But Damari Brown's a guy like that. I think, obviously tons of teams in the country want him. That'd be a huge win for them. And And I think it's probably a Miami FSU race right now. But getting him would be a huge addition, like I said.
Yeah, definitely. So as far as the guys like what did you say? You said Jabril Rawls and Quindarius Jones. I'm not super familiar with because they're not around my area, and I know Florida didn't really recruit them that much. But Kenton Kirkland is somebody that I'm very familiar with, and I think he's very underrated at the safety position. I think you got Florida State got a steal there. But I live in the Orlando area. I hear a lot about what goes on with UCF. So I can't let the people from Orlando not hear the inside story on Darren Goldie Lawrence, who is, I believe, actually at UCF's game tonight against SMU. Somebody that UCF's working very hard to flip. Do you think that's somebody that FSU keeps in the class, or are they even trying to keep him in the class, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, they're definitely trying to keep him in the class. He's a guy they value a lot. I'm sure you're familiar, Kewan Ratliff, who's now an off the field guy for FSU. They have a really close relationship. I talked to Goldie a few weeks ago, just kind of getting an update on his recruitment, and he sounded pretty locked in. I asked him basically, is this UCF buzz around him about them potentially flipping him legit? And he basically laughed. So I don't know, recruiting's crazy. So I'm not going to say it's not going to happen. But right now, I'm not too worried. If he sets up an official there, I get a little bit more worried. But he continues to come back to the FSU and say all the right things. So for right now, I'm not shedding too much light on it. But if things get serious there, then I'll report on it. But yeah, I'm not too worried right now.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt that UCF's about 25 minutes away from home, and he's got a bunch of
Sure.
former teammates that were there. So, at the very least, he's there to show support to his former teammates playing for the Knights now. So, I mean, I've had you here for a little while. I want to ask you just one more question, man. Um, Obviously, like we said, FSU's got a great recruiting class started. Only 16 prospects committed, 16th ranked in the country. Is there one or maybe two prospects in particular that you think maybe don't get enough love as far as like an underrated recruit that you think could burst onto the scene late in their senior season, or somebody that you just think's flying under the radar that shouldn't?
Yeah, I would definitely go with Florida State three-star receiver commit Vandrevius Jacobs. He's had an awesome start to his senior season. He's at Vero Beach High School. Last year he had a pretty productive season, but he's really turned it on this year. I had the stats pulled up in front of me. So in 6 games, he has 38 catches for 711 yards and 14 receiving touchdowns. I posted a bunch of his clips like weekly on my Twitter, just of him dominating every week. He's super impressive. I did a full feature story on him the other day, and his coach is just super impressed with him and just his mindset, his mentality. So he's a guy that I really think is flying under the radar, who I think could have a really special career in Tallahassee.
Yeah, I actually scrolled through your Twitter profile and saw those clips, so I figured he was going to be the one that you brought up. But Vero Beach has kind of a history of producing some pretty good talent. 14 touchdowns in 6 games is just unreal, regardless of what level, what classification you play at. And Vero Beach is in one of the better classifications in the state of Florida. So, really an unbelievable productive year as a senior. But yeah, man, other than that, really appreciate you joining us to talk a little bit about Florida State's recruiting and their recruiting class, and give us a little bit of insight into the program. I know people are very excited to see how they perform the rest of this year, especially these next 2 weeks up against two of the top teams in the country. So we'll definitely be tuned in. But before we get you out of here, man, just shout out your Twitter, social media profiles, your website, where people can read your articles and just all the great stuff that you produce for Noles 247.
I appreciate it, son. Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at zblostein247, and I write for Noles 24/7, the FSU 24/7 Sports website. We post a ton of recruiting content. If you're an FSU fan, it's a great place to find whatever you need FSU wise. We're at every practice. Luckily, Mike Norvell is letting us, see full practices during the week, multiple times a week. So access is great, and I would definitely recommend getting over there if you're an avid FSU fan.
Yeah, that's unheard of that the coach allows you guys to
Yeah.
go in and view full practices. So if you're an FSU fan, definitely be sure to tune in to Noles 247. If you're not an FSU fan, still you can tune in and try and see what your rivals are doing or what have you.
Yeah.
So don't just limit it to FSU fans. Let everybody go in there, take a look, and see what's going on. But Zach, really appreciate you joining us this evening. All the great content that you put out will definitely be supporting you, man. And thank you for your time.
Appreciate you, Connor.
All right. Have a great evening, man.
You too.
Excellent interview this evening with Zach Blostein, one of the very best in the writing world of recruiting. He does a great job covering Florida State. For those of you that do not know, I mean, probably everybody does, but I cover Florida. But that does not mean there is a rivalry in the recruiting writing industry. Zach does a phenomenal job. I've followed him ever since he was an intern with Noles 247, and he has really just grown up and progressed and become one of the leaders in recruiting writing in the country. And really excited that we could have him on here to give us a little more insight into Florida State's recruiting class. Because, like I said, we've spoken at length about Coach Atkins, about Florida State's ability to recruit this year specifically, and he give us a little bit more insight as to why they're doing so well. We'll see how they do in the remainder of their schedule this year. Looking forward to seeing how that turns out, though. I know a lot of Florida fans that tune into this will definitely be tuned in to see how Roderick Kearney's recruitment turns out. Was pretty interesting to hear that Zach still thinks that it would be Florida tentatively right now. So we'll see if Florida can close the door on that or if Florida State can keep him committed in this class. But we'll move on back to where we left off with our commitments for the week. We've got 5-star number one defensive lineman David Hicks. David Hicks surprised a lot of people. I think many, including myself, thought he was going to be headed to Oklahoma. I think there was an article posted that within the last 24 hours, David made the decision to flip, and not publicly flip, but flip his decision from Oklahoma to Texas A&M. He committed to the Aggies. The Aggies land the number one defensive lineman in the country over programs such as Oklahoma, Miami, Oregon, Texas, Michigan State, and Alabama. And then 4-star number 10 wide receiver Jalen Hale. I mean, I had a rough streak on predictions in the last episode we were on. Jalen Hale committed to Alabama over Texas and Georgia. I think Curtis and myself both thought he would commit to Texas. Alabama was one of those schools that was always right there in the recruitment. And obviously, they did enough to secure the commitment of a top 10 wide receiver in the country out of Longview, Texas. So great commitment there for the Crimson Tide as they continue to land blue chip wide receivers and continue to land prospects from the state of Texas. They've done a very good job with that. And actually, wide receivers coach, I think it's Holloman Wiggins for Alabama, was named On Three's assistant coach recruiter of the month by landing Jalen Hale as well as a couple others. 4-star safety Braxton Myers, another prospect from Coppell, Texas, commits to Ole Miss over LSU and Auburn. Myers decommitted from the USC Trojans on September 7th. So a quick turnaround there for Myers, making his decision to go take his talents to the SEC, commit to Lane Kiffin, a program that just had a signature win in this. I think they're in the top 15 now. And then we'll move on to 4-star wide receiver Tyler Williams from Lakeland High School. He committed to the Georgia Bulldogs over South Carolina, Clemson, Miami, and Texas A&M. A lot of people thought it was going to come down to Georgia and Miami, but Tyler kind of surprised everybody at his commitment ceremony where he announced that Georgia ended up winning out over a very close second in South Carolina. Miami, I guess, was not in it as much as most people thought, but he made the commitment to the Bulldogs, as many were expecting, including Curtis and myself. And then four-star offensive tackle Elijah Page from Phoenix, Arizona, committed to the USC Trojans. So not all bad news over the course of the last month for the Trojans. They lost Braxton Myers, but added four-star offensive tackle Elijah Page. Page decommitted from Notre Dame within the last couple weeks, and Page had over 30 offers to choose from, but decided to take his talents to California right after his official visit with the Trojans. And then 2024, four-star cornerback Jamari Howard from Hialeah, Florida, commits to Michigan State over Alabama, Georgia, Miami, and many others. Impressive pickup for the Spartans, as they now have a four-star from the state of Florida. And that wraps it up for our commitments this evening. There are a couple of noteworthy commitment dates that are set over the course of the next week or so. One being Randy Pittman, a tight end from Lynn Haven, Florida. He is a former Florida State commit that all signs point towards the UCF Knights, but he has a commitment date set for October 8th. And then the next one that we're going to talk about is three-star safety Bryce Thornton, who has a commitment date set for October 13th. Bryce Thornton is from Milton High School, one of the powerhouse programs in the state of Georgia, and he will be making his commitment, what it looks like, between Alabama and Florida. So big time recruitment there. Bryce Thornton, to me, is one of the more underrated prospects in the country, though he's a three-star composite, and really on almost every side. I think On3 is the only one that has him as a four-star at this time. Thornton's offer list screams elite, with offers from Alabama, Florida, Clemson, Florida State, Georgia, Miami, Ole Miss, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas. Just the list goes on and on. One of those prospects that I think the offers tell more about the prospect than the actual ranking. If you turn on his film, he is somebody that is very, very good and somebody that's very, very sought after on the recruiting market. But with that being said, short show tonight, nothing too crazy this evening. Obviously, want to shout out our other sponsor, and that's going to be Dying to Self. Dying to Self is a faith-based clothing company that is all about selfless living, designed with various aesthetic and neutral styles and colors of shirts and hoodies with top quality and comfort in mind. Use promo code Varsity10 at dyingtoself.co and get 10% off your order. Once again, that is dyingtoself.co, promo code Varsity10 for 10% off your order and support the podcast. Once again, guys, I want to apologize that we were not on air last week. We didn't have a podcast drop due to the effects of Hurricane Ian. Please, guys, all prayers and hope to those affected by Hurricane Ian. We hope anybody that was affected is having a quick and speedy recovery. Thoughts and prayers are with you guys, and we appreciate anybody that is putting first responders, going out and helping those that are in need down in Southwest Florida, as this is a very tough time for a lot of people in the state of Florida. Luckily enough, myself and my family in Orlando were okay, but there are many others that were affected by it. So please, guys, thoughts and prayers to all those down there affected by the hurricane. But with that being said, we're going to take it out. Because it's myself this evening, we don't have any other people to object to my song request. So I am going to go with Prosper by Russ. And with that being said, Roll Up Varsity, signing off.